John Miller lived a life that many would call ordinary, but to him it was anything but. Every morning, as the sun peeked over the horizon, he rose from his bed with purpose. The rooster crowed, signaling the start of another day on the farm. John didn't mind the early mornings or the long hours under the sun. In fact, he loved them. For decades, he had worked the same land, planting seeds in the spring, nurturing crops through the summer, and harvesting in the fall. His hands were rough and weathered, marked by years of hard labor, but they told the story of a man who took pride in what he did. The farm wasn't much to look at if you compared it to the big operations out west, the ones with shiny tractors and endless fields stretching as far as the eye could see. But to John, every acre held meaning. It was the place where he had built his life, raised his family, and created memories that no amount of money could buy. The red barn stood tall, despite its age, the paint peeling here and there, but still sturdy enough to house his cows and chickens. The house itself was modest, with white siding that needed a fresh coat of paint and a porch swing that creaked when the wind blew. Yet it was home, a word that carried more weight for John than most people realized. His wife, Mary, was the heart of their little world. She kept things running smoothly behind the scenes, cooking meals, tending to the garden, and making sure John didn't work himself too hard. They didn't have much in terms of material wealth, but they didn't need it. Their happiness came from simpler things, sitting together on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, hearing the laughter of grandchildren during visits, and knowing that they had each other through, thick and thin. Their son Richard had been different from the moment he was born. Even as a child, he showed signs of being ambitious. While other kids played outside or helped with chores, Richard spent hours reading books borrowed from the town library. He dreamed of something bigger than the farm, something beyond the small town, life that seemed to suit everyone else just fine. When he turned 18, he packed his bags and left for college, promising to visit often. But as time went on, those visits became fewer and farther between. Letters came less frequently and phone calls were short. Eventually, the gap between father and son grew wider. Despite this, John never resented Richard for leaving. Deep down, he understood the pull of dreams and the desire to make something of oneself. Still, it stung a little whenever someone in town mentioned how successful Richard had become. People talked about him like he was some kind of celebrity. Richard Miller, the self-made millionaire who ran one of the biggest agricultural companies in the country. To the townsfolk, Richard's success was proof that anyone could rise above their circumstances if they tried hard enough. But to John, it felt like a reminder of all the moments they had missed together. What few people knew, however, was that Richard hadn't completely cut ties with his past. Though he rarely spoke about it publicly, he carried his father's lessons with him wherever he went. John had taught him the value of hard work, honesty, and perseverance, qualities that had helped Richard climb the corporate ladder. And while Richard may have traded overalls for tailored suits, part of him remained rooted in the soil of his childhood. Life in the small Iowa town moved slowly, almost predictably. Days blended into weeks, and seasons changed without fanfare. Most folks liked it that way. There was comfort in routine, in knowing your neighbors and waving hello as you passed them on the road. Gossip traveled fast, though, and everyone had an opinion about everything. Some admired John for sticking to his roots, while others whispered that he must feel embarrassed having such a high-powered son who never came around anymore. John paid no attention to the chatter. He had learned long ago that living according to other people's expectations only led to disappointment. One thing that set John apart from many of his peers was his refusal to sell his land. Over the years, developers and corporations had approached him multiple times offering large sums of money for his property. Each time John politely declined. "This land is my legacy," he would say. "It's not for sale." To him, the idea of selling out felt like giving up a piece of himself. Besides, he couldn't imagine doing anything else with his life. Farming wasn't just a job. It was who he was. Mary supported her husband's decision wholeheartedly. She believed in the importance of holding on to what mattered most. Together, They faced challenges head-on, whether it was dealing with bad weather, equipment breakdowns, or fluctuating market prices. They weren't rich, but they were content. Contentment, John often thought, was a treasure that couldn't be bought. Then one day something unusual happened. A sleek black car pulled into the driveway, kicking up dust as it came to a stop. John was outside fixing a fence post when he noticed the vehicle. It looked out of place among the tractors and hay bales scattered around the yard. Curious, he wiped his hands on his jeans and walked over to greet the unexpected visitors. Two men stepped out of the car, both wearing expensive suits that looked tailor-made. They introduced themselves as representatives from Agritech Solutions, a company interested in acquiring farmland for expansion. John listened politely as they explained their proposal, nodding occasionally but saying very little. When they finally handed him a folder containing the details of their offer, he opened it and scanned the numbers. His brow furrowed slightly as he realized the amount was far below what his land was worth. Without hesitation, he shook his head and told them he wasn't interested. The men exchanged glances, clearly unaccustomed to rejection. "You don't understand," one of them said, his tone laced with condescension. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You'd be foolish to turn it down." John simply smiled and replied, "I've made my decision. Now if you'll excuse me, I've got work to do." As the men climbed back into their car and drove away, John couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be the last he heard from them. Little did he know, their visit was just the beginning of a chain of events that would change everything, for better or worse. The next morning, John woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside his window. It was a peaceful start to the day, just like any other. He went about his usual routine, feeding the animals, checking on the crops, and sipping a cup of coffee, while leaning against the fence post. But as he stood there, gazing out at the fields that stretched before him, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest after yesterday's encounter with the men in suits. Mary noticed it too. Over breakfast, she asked him if something was bothering him. John hesitated for a moment before telling her about the visit from Agritech Solutions. "They're offering me money for the farm," he said, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "But it's not enough. Not nearly enough." Mary frowned. "Did they say why they want it so badly?" John shrugged. "Something about expanding their operations. They didn't give me many details, but I could tell they weren't used to." Hearing no, he chuckled softly, though there wasn't much humor in it. "One of them even called me foolish for turning them down." Mary reached across the table and placed a reassuring hand on his. "You did the right thing, John. This land is your life. You can't put a price on that." He nodded, grateful for her support. Still, the thought lingered in the back of his mind. What if they came back? What if they tried to pressure him into selling? John pushed the worries aside and focused on the tasks ahead. Worrying wouldn't change anything, and besides, he had work to do. Later that afternoon, as John was repairing a broken gate near the edge of the property, he saw a familiar truck pull into the driveway. It belonged to Paul Dawson, another farmer, from town. Paul was a few years younger than John and had always been friendly enough, though their personalities were quite different. Where John was quiet and reserved, Paul was loud and boisterous. He liked to talk, a lot, and often inserted himself into conversations whether he was invited or not. John waved as Paul stepped out of the truck. "What brings you out here?" he asked. Paul grinned and tipped his hat. "Just thought I'd stop by and see how things are going. Haven't seen you at the diner in a while. Figured you might be lonely out here all by yourself." John chuckled. "Lonely? With Mary around? Never." "Well, still," Paul said, leaning casually against the hood of his truck. "It gets boring working the same patch of dirt every day, doesn't it? Don't you ever think about doing something else, maybe retiring early and letting someone else take over?" John shook his head. "This is my home, Paul. I'm not looking to retire anytime soon." Paul raised an eyebrow. "Even if someone offered you a pile of cash to walk away?" John paused, wondering how Paul knew about the offer. Had the men from Agritech been talking? Or maybe word had already spread through town. Either way, he decided to play it cool. Let's just say I've had offers before, but none of them have been worth it. Paul nodded, though his expression suggested he didn't fully agree. I hear you. Still, times are changing, John. Big companies like Agritech, they're taking over everywhere. If you don't sell now, you might miss your chance. John bristled slightly at the implication but kept his tone calm. I appreciate your concern, Paul, but I've made up my mind. This land stays with me. Paul held up his hands in mock surrender. Hey, don't shoot the messenger. I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking. Everyone else? John echoed, raising an eyebrow. Paul shrugged. You know how it is in this town. People talk. Some folks think you're crazy for holding on to this place when you could be living easy somewhere else. Others, well, let's just say they're surprised Richard hasn't convinced you to sell yet. At the mention of his son's name, John felt a pang of irritation. Richard has nothing to do with this, he said firmly. And neither does anyone else. This is my decision. Paul seemed to sense he had struck a nerve because he quickly changed the subject. Anyway, I didn't mean to upset you. Just figured I'd stop by and check in. Let me know if you need help with anything. John thanked him curtly and watched as Paul climbed back into his truck and drove off. Once he was gone, John let out a long sigh. Conversations like that always left him feeling drained. He understood that people meant well, but sometimes their opinions carried more weight than they realized. Deep down, he wondered if Paul was right, if he really was being stubborn for refusing to sell. But then he reminded himself of all the reasons he loved this place, and the doubts faded away. 2 days later, the men in suits returned. This time, they brought reinforcements. A second car pulled into the driveway behind theirs, and out stepped 2 more individuals, 1 man and 1 woman. They looked polished and professional, their clothes pressed and their shoes gleaming. John recognized Kevin, the man who had called him foolish during their last meeting. The others introduced themselves as colleagues from Agritech Solutions, though they didn't bother sharing their names. We'd like to discuss our proposal further, Kevin began, his tone clipped and businesslike. Surely you've had time to reconsider. John crossed his arms and stood his ground. I haven't and I won't. My answer is still no. Kevin exchanged a glance with his companions, then sighed dramatically. Mr. Miller, we're trying to be reasonable here. This isn't just about money, it's about progress. Selling your land would allow us to bring jobs and economic growth to this area. Isn't that something you'd want for your community? It sounds nice, John admitted, but I don't believe you're doing this out of the goodness of your heart. You're here because you see an opportunity to make a profit. And that's fine, I get it. But this land means more to me than profit ever could. The woman spoke, up for the first time, her voice smooth and calculated. With respect, Mr. Miller, sentimentality doesn't pay the bills. Times are changing and small farms like yours are becoming obsolete. Wouldn't it be better to adapt rather than cling to the past? John felt a flicker of anger rise in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. Times may be changing, but some things never will. Like integrity, like knowing where you come from. I built this farm with my own 2 hands, and I'll decide its future, not you. The room fell silent for a moment, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, unexpectedly, the front door creaked open and Mary appeared carrying a tray of lemonade. She smiled warmly at the visitors, seemingly unaware of the heated exchange that had just taken place. Can I interest anyone in a drink? She offered. The group murmured polite refusals, but Kevin seized the opportunity to shift gears. Your wife seems lovely, he said, his tone noticeably softer. It must be hard for her, watching you turn down such a generous offer. Doesn't she deserve a little comfort in her golden years? John's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Mary stepped forward. Her voice was sweet, but there was steel beneath it. My husband and I have been together for 40 years. We've faced plenty of challenges, and we'll face plenty more. Comfort isn't something we measure in dollars and cents. Kevin blinked, clearly caught off guard by her candor. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, sensing they weren't going to win this round, The representatives gathered their things and prepared to leave. As they headed toward the door, Kevin turned back one last time. "We'll be in touch," he said, his words carrying a hint of warning. Once they were gone, Mary set the tray down and wrapped her arms around John. "Don't let them get to you," she whispered. "They don't understand what this place means to us." John hugged her tightly, drawing strength from her presence. "I know," he said, "but I can't help feeling like this isn't over." Little did he know, he was absolutely right. The days that followed felt heavier than usual for John. Though the representatives from Agritech Solutions had left, their words lingered in his mind like an unwelcome guest. Kevin's comments about sentimentality not paying the bills and Mary's comfort echoed in his thoughts whenever he paused to rest. It wasn't just the offer itself that bothered him. It was the way they had spoken to him, as if he were nothing more than a stubborn old man standing in the way of progress. Mary noticed the change in him. He wasn't as quick to laugh or share stories over dinner. At night, when they sat on the porch watching the stars, she could see the wheels turning in his head. She didn't push him to talk, though. Instead, she stayed by his side, offering quiet support in the way only she knew how. One afternoon, as John was working in the barn, he heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel. Thinking it might be Paul again, or worse, the men in suits, he stepped outside to investigate. To his surprise, it wasn't either of them. A sleek black car pulled into the driveway, its shiny surface reflecting the sunlight. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a tall man dressed in an expensive suit. His hair was neatly combed, and his shoes looked like they'd never seen a speck of dirt. Behind him, a young woman with a clipboard emerged from the passenger side. John frowned, unsure what to make of this new arrival. "Can I help you?" he called out, his voice steady but cautious. The man smiled warmly as he approached. "Mr. Miller, I presume? My name is Richard Davidson. I'm here on behalf of Agritech Solutions." The name didn't ring any bells for John, but something about the man's demeanor seemed oddly familiar. Before John could respond, the woman spoke up. "We've been trying to reach you regarding your property," she said briskly, flipping through papers on her clipboard. "This is our final attempt to present our offer." John sighed, feeling the frustration rise again. "I already told your colleagues that I'm not interested. I don't care how many times you come back, the answer won't change." Richard held up a hand, silencing the woman. "Please, Mr. Miller, hear us out. We're prepared to make adjustments to the terms. Surely we can find common ground." Before John could reply, the front door creaked open and Mary stepped onto the porch. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of the visitors, but she quickly composed herself. "John, who are these people?" she asked. "This is—" John began, trailing off as he gestured toward Richard. "Richard Davidson," the man finished smoothly. "And this is my assistant, Emily." He turned his attention to Mary, his smile widening. "You must be Mrs. Miller. It's a pleasure to meet you." Mary nodded politely but kept her distance. "What brings you here, Mr. Davidson?" "We're here to discuss the future of your property," Richard explained. "Agritech Solutions believes strongly in the potential of this land. With the right investment, it could become part of something truly remarkable." John crossed his arms, his patience wearing thin. "I've heard all this before. You'll have to forgive me if I don't get excited about your vision." Richard tilted his head, studying John carefully. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, though John didn't notice it. "You remind me of someone," Richard said after a moment. "Someone who taught me the value of hard work and integrity." John raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? And who might that be?" "My father," Richard replied softly. For a split second, there was silence. Then, slowly, realization dawned on Mary's face. Her hand flew to her mouth as she gasped. "Richard," she whispered, her voice trembling. Richard's gaze softened as he looked at her. "Hello, Mom." Time seemed to stop. John stared at the man in front of him, unable to process what was happening. The polished executive, the CEO of Agritech Solutions, this was his son? The same boy who had left home years ago, chasing dreams bigger than the farm. It didn't seem possible, and yet as John looked closer, he could see traces of the young man he used to know. The shape of his jaw, the curve of his smile. They were unmistakable. "Richard?" John finally managed to say, his voice hoarse. "Is it really you?" "It's me, Dad," Richard confirmed, stepping forward. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I wanted to surprise you." Mary hurried down the steps and threw her arms around her son, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, Richard, look at you. You're all grown up." John hung back, still struggling to reconcile the image of his son with the man standing before him. Part of him felt proud. Proud of everything Richard had achieved. Proud that he had made something of himself. But another part of him couldn't ignore the irony of the situation. All this time, the people pressuring him to sell his land had been working for his own son. "What are you doing here, Richard?" John asked, his tone sharper than he intended. "If you wanted to visit, why didn't you just come alone? Why bring all these suits?" Richard's expression turned serious. "Dad, I didn't know you were involved until recently. When I found out my team was negotiating with you, I came as soon as I could. I didn't want anyone treating you disrespectfully." John snorted. "Too late for that. Your friends have been calling me foolish and telling me I'm holding on to the past. They even tried to guilt-trip your mother into convincing me to sell." Emily shifted uncomfortably beside Richard, clearly aware that she was partly responsible for the tension. Richard glanced at her, then back at his father. "I'm sorry, Dad. That wasn't how I wanted this to go. Let me handle it." With that, Richard turned to Emily and motioned for her to leave. "Pack up the car and wait for me there," he instructed. "I'll take care of things from here." Once Emily was gone, Richard walked over to John and extended a hand. "Let's start over, okay? No business talk, no pressure. Just family." John hesitated, then shook his son's hand. For the first time in years, they stood face to face, father and son, without the weight of distance or misunderstanding between them. It wasn't perfect. There was still so much to say, but it was a beginning. As the three of them sat together on the porch, catching up on lost time, John couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Pride, yes, but also sadness. How many years had they missed because Richard had been too busy building his empire? And now, with Richard sitting here, wearing a $1,000 suit and talking about mergers and acquisitions, John wondered if they would ever truly reconnect. But for now, at least they had each other. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The porch was quiet except for the occasional creak of the swing as it swayed gently in the breeze. John, Mary, and Richard sat together, trying to bridge the gap of years that had grown between them. For a while, no one spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it carried the weight of unspoken words and unanswered questions. Finally, Mary broke the stillness. "So, Richard," she began, her voice soft but curious. "Tell us about your life. What's it like running such a big company?" Richard smiled faintly, leaning back in his chair. "It's busy," he admitted. "There are always meetings, decisions to make, problems to solve. Sometimes it feels like I'm juggling 100 things at once. But I love what I do. It's rewarding to see how far we've come." John listened intently, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't say anything, but his eyes searched his son's face, looking for traces of the boy he used to know. "Does it ever get lonely?" he asked suddenly, surprising even himself. Richard hesitated before answering. "Sometimes," he admitted. "I don't have much time for friends or hobbies anymore. Work takes up most of my day. But I remind myself why I started all this, to create something meaningful, something that could last." Mary reached out and placed a hand on Richard's arm. "You've done so well for yourself, sweetheart. We're proud of you." Richard nodded, though there was a flicker of sadness in his eyes. "Thanks, Mom. That means a lot." He glanced at John, who was still watching him closely. "Dad, I know I haven't been around much. I should have visited more often. I'm sorry." John sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It is what it is, Richard. You had dreams, and you chased them. I can't fault you for that, but I won't lie, it wasn't easy watching you leave this place. He gestured toward the field stretching beyond the porch. This place was supposed to be ours, together. Richard looked down at his hands, guilt etched across his features. I never meant to hurt you, Dad. I wanted to prove myself. To show you that I could succeed on my own. You don't need to prove anything to me, John said firmly. You were always enough, Richard. Always. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. Then Richard cleared his throat and changed the subject. About the land. I had no idea my team was pressuring you to sell. If I'd known, I would have stopped them immediately. John raised an eyebrow. They work for you, don't they? Shouldn't you keep better track of what they're doing? Richard winced at the criticism but nodded. You're right, I dropped the ball on this one. I'll make sure they leave you alone from now on. Mary chimed in, her tone gentle but firm. That's good to hear, Richard. Your father has worked hard for this farm. It's not just dirt and crops, it's his life. I understand that now, Richard replied. And I respect it. Truly. He paused, then added, but if you ever change your mind about selling, let me know. I'll make sure you get a fair deal. No tricks, no pressure. John shook his head. I appreciate the offer, but this land isn't going anywhere. Not while I'm alive. Richard didn't argue. Instead, he smiled faintly. Fair enough. I guess some things never change. As the evening wore on, their conversation shifted to lighter topics. Stories from the past, memories of holidays spent together, and updates on distant relatives. By the time the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, the tension that had hung in the air earlier had eased considerably. For the first time in years, John felt like he was reconnecting with his son. The next morning, word spread quickly through the small town about Richard's visit. People whispered excitedly about seeing the sleek black car parked in front of the Miller farmhouse. Paul Dawson was among the first to hear about it, and he wasted no time showing up at John's door. Is it true? Paul blurted out as soon as John answered. Was that really Richard Miller, the CEO of Agritech Solutions, at your house yesterday? John nodded, keeping his expression neutral. Yeah, it was him. Paul's jaw dropped. Wow, wow, I had no idea he was your son. Neither did most people, John said dryly. He doesn't talk about it much. Paul scratched the back of his head, clearly flustered. Well, I guess I owe you an apology. The other day when I said those things about Richard convincing you to sell, I didn't mean any harm by it. I just thought... You thought wrong, John interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. My son respects my decision even if you don't. Paul flushed red, stammering an apology. Of course, I'm sorry, John. I shouldn't have assumed. It's fine, John said, waving him off. Just remember, you don't know everything about a person's life, no matter how much you think you do. With that, Paul left, looking thoroughly chastened. Over the next few days, similar scenes played out with other townsfolk who had doubted John or mocked his refusal to sell. Each time, John handled the situation with grace, refusing to hold grudges but making it clear that he expected respect moving forward. Meanwhile, Richard stayed in town longer than he had planned. He spent his days helping John with chores around the farm, relearning the rhythms of rural life. At first it was awkward. He wasn't used to manual labor anymore, but he slowly found his footing. There was something grounding about working alongside his father, feeling the earth beneath his feet and the sun on his back. One afternoon, as they repaired a fence together, Richard spoke up. Dad, I want to thank you for everything, for teaching me the value of hard work, for giving me roots even when I chose to leave. I wouldn't be where I am today without you. John stopped hammering and looked at his son. You turned out okay, Richard. Better than okay. I just wish we hadn't lost so much time. We can't go back, Richard said quietly. But we can move forward. Together. John nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I'd like that. By the time Richard prepared to leave, The bond between father and son had grown stronger than it had been in years. As he hugged John goodbye, Richard promised to visit more often, and this time, he meant it. Driving away from the farm, Richard glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the fields disappear into the distance. Despite his success in the corporate world, he realized that nothing compared to the simple joy of being home, even if only for a little while. The weeks that followed Richard's visit brought a noticeable change to the small town. Word of his identity as John Miller's son spread like wildfire, and soon everyone had an opinion about it. Some folks were impressed by the revelation, marveling at how far Richard had come from his humble beginnings. Others felt guilty for their earlier comments about John, especially those who had mocked him for refusing to sell his land. Even Paul Dawson seemed to soften his tone whenever he mentioned the Millers now, often praising John for standing his ground. For John, life returned to its usual rhythm, waking up early, tending to the animals and working in the fields, but there was a newfound sense of peace in his heart. Knowing that Richard understood and respected his decision about the farm meant more to him than any amount of money ever could. Mary noticed the difference too. Her husband walked with a lighter step, and his laughter came easier these days. It wasn't just the reunion with Richard that had lifted his spirits, it was also the respect he'd earned from the people around him. Still, not everything settled down so easily. The representatives from Agritech Solutions hadn't given up entirely. Though Richard had ordered them to leave John alone, they continued to circle the issue like hawks waiting for an opening. Every few days, someone would call or send a letter, politely reminding John of their offer. Each time he ignored them, tossing their letters into the trash without reading them. But one day, something unexpected happened. It was mid-morning, when a delivery truck pulled into the driveway. John was out back fixing a tractor when he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. A young man wearing a uniform stood at the edge of the yard, holding a clipboard. "Mr. Miller?" he called out. John wiped his hands on a rag and walked over. "That's me. What can I do for you?" "I have a package for you," the delivery man said, handing over a large envelope. "Sign here, please." Curious, John scribbled his name on the clipboard and took the envelope. He waited until the truck drove away before opening it. Inside was a formal letter addressed to him, written on official Agritech Solutions stationery. At first glance, it looked like another attempt to persuade him to sell, but as he read further, his eyebrows shot up in surprise. The letter wasn't from the company's representatives, it was from Richard himself. In clear, straightforward language, Richard explained that he had reviewed the situation and decided to take matters into his own hands. Effective immediately, all negotiations regarding John's property were suspended. Furthermore, Richard announced plans to establish a new initiative aimed at supporting small farmers like his father. The program would provide resources, training, and financial assistance to help independent farmers compete in an increasingly challenging market. John read the letter twice, making sure he understood every word. When Mary found him sitting at the kitchen table later that afternoon, she could tell something was different. "What is it?" she asked, peering over his shoulder. "It's from Richard," John replied, sliding the letter across the table. "Read it." Mary scanned the pages, her eyes widening as she reached the part about the new initiative. "Oh, John, this is incredible. He's really doing it. He's helping people like us." John nodded slowly, a mixture of pride and disbelief swirling inside him. "I never thought I'd see the day when my son used his power to stand up for farmers instead of pushing them aside." Mary smiled softly. "He learned from the best, didn't he?" Despite the positive turn of events, John couldn't shake the feeling that trouble might still be lurking nearby. Sure enough, his suspicions proved correct when Kevin, the same arrogant representative who had insulted him during the initial meeting, showed up unannounced a few days later. This time, however, Kevin wasn't alone. Accompanying him was a wiry man with sharp features and a calculating expression. They introduced themselves as lawyers representing Agritech Solutions, though John doubted they were there to chat casually. "We need to discuss your involvement in this matter," Kevin began, his tone clipped and professional. "Your refusal to cooperate has caused significant delays in our operations." John crossed his arms, his patience already wearing thin. I don't recall agreeing to cooperate in the first place. Last I checked, this is my land, and I'll decide what happens to it. The second lawyer stepped forward, his voice smooth but laced with menace. Be careful, Mr. Miller. Refusing to negotiate could have legal consequences. Are you prepared to face those risks? John narrowed his eyes, recognizing the threat for what it was. Are you threatening me? No threats, the lawyer replied coolly. Just stating facts. Companies like ours have ways of dealing with obstacles. If you persist in blocking our progress, we may have no choice but to explore other options. Before John could respond, the front door opened, and Mary appeared. She took one look at the tense scene unfolding in her parlor and immediately stepped between the men and her husband. Is there a problem here? She asked, her voice calm but firm. Kevin forced a smile. Not at all, Mrs. Miller. We're simply discussing business matters with your husband. Well, I think you've discussed enough, Mary said, her tone leaving no room for argument. You've made your point, and now it's time for you to leave. The lawyers exchanged glances, clearly unaccustomed to being dismissed so boldly. After a moment of hesitation, they gathered their things and headed toward the door. As they left, Kevin turned back briefly. This isn't over, Mr. Miller, not by a long shot. Once they were gone, Mary closed the door firmly and turned to John. What was that all about? They're trying to scare me into selling, John muttered, shaking his head. But they won't succeed. Mary placed a reassuring hand on his arm. They don't know who they're dealing with. Later that evening, John called Richard to update him on the situation. To his relief, Richard didn't hesitate to act. Don't worry, Dad, he said confidently. I'll handle this. No one threatens my family and gets away with it. True. To his word, Richard wasted no time addressing the issue. Within days, news broke that Agritech Solutions had launched an internal investigation into misconduct among its staff. Several high-ranking executives, including Kevin, were placed on administrative leave pending further review. Meanwhile, Richard issued a public statement reaffirming the company's commitment to ethical practices and transparency. The impact was immediate. Townsfolk who had once doubted John's resolve now rallied behind him, offering words of encouragement and support. Even Paul Dawson stopped by to express his solidarity. If anyone gives you trouble, let me know, he said, earnestly. We've got your back, John. As the dust settled, John reflected on everything that had happened. He realized that while he had always valued simplicity and hard work, sometimes standing up for what you believe in required courage, and even a little help from unexpected places. With Richard by his side, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. One crisp autumn morning, as John stood on the porch watching the sunrise, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. The farm was safe, his family was united, and the community had come together in ways he hadn't anticipated. Life wasn't perfect, but it was good, and for John Miller that was more than enough. The months passed and the small town settled into a new kind of rhythm. The drama surrounding John Miller's land faded into the background, replaced by quieter, more hopeful conversations. People talked about Richard's initiative to support local farmers, speculating on how it might change their lives. For the first time in years, there was a sense of optimism in the air, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. John and Mary noticed the shift too. Neighbors who had once been indifferent or even critical now went out of their way to wave hello or stop by for a chat. Some brought homemade pies or jars of preserves as gestures of goodwill. Others offered to lend a hand with chores around the farm. It wasn't much, but it meant something, to know that people cared, that they weren't alone. Richard stayed true to his promise to visit more often. Every few weeks he'd drive down from the city, leaving behind the chaos of board meetings and conference calls. He didn't come empty-handed either. Sometimes he brought tools or equipment to help with repairs. Other times, he arrived with fresh ideas for improving the farm's efficiency. But what mattered most to John was simply having his son around, working side by side, sharing meals, and talking late into the night. One crisp Saturday morning, As golden sunlight spilled across the fields, Richard rolled up his sleeves and joined John in planting a new crop of corn. They worked in companionable silence, their movements synchronized after years of practice. Finally, Richard spoke up. "You know, Dad, I've been thinking, maybe I should move back here." John paused, leaning on his hoe. "What?" "I'm serious," Richard said, brushing dirt off his hands. "I love my job, but it's exhausting. And honestly, I miss this. The quiet, the simplicity. Being here reminds me of why I started all this in the first place." John studied his son, carefully, searching for any hint of doubt. "Are you sure? You've built a life in the city. What about your company?" "I can still run it remotely," Richard replied. "Technology makes it easier than ever. Besides, I've earned the right to step back a little. Let someone else handle the day-to-day stuff while I focus on what really matters." Mary overheard the conversation from the porch and couldn't contain her excitement. "Oh, Richard," she exclaimed, rushing over. "That would be wonderful. We'd love to have you home." John hesitated, torn between pride and practicality. "It's a big decision, son. Are you ready for that kind of change?" "I think so," Richard said, smiling. "And if it doesn't work out, I can always go back. But I owe it to myself, and to you two, to try." By spring, Richard had made the move official. He rented a modest house near the edge of town, close enough to the farm that he could drop by whenever he wanted. Adjusting to rural life wasn't easy at first. He missed the convenience of city amenities and the buzz of constant activity, but he quickly grew to appreciate the slower pace. There was something deeply satisfying about waking up to birdsong instead of car horns, about seeing tangible results from a hard day's work. With Richard nearby, the family dynamic shifted in subtle ways. Sundays became sacred. A day set aside for shared meals, laughter, and stories. Mary took great pleasure in cooking elaborate dinners, filling the house with the aroma of roasted chicken and freshly baked bread. Even the grandchildren visited, more often, delighted by the idea of spending weekends exploring the farm with their uncle. But perhaps the greatest change was in John himself. He seemed younger somehow, lighter on his feet and quicker to smile. Having Richard back gave him a renewed sense of purpose. Together, they tackled projects they'd put off for years, repairing the old barn, digging a new irrigation ditch, and even starting a vegetable garden. Each task brought them closer, bridging the gap that had formed during Richard's absence. Meanwhile, Richard's efforts to support local farmers began bearing fruit. His initiative provided training sessions on sustainable farming practices, introduced affordable loans for equipment upgrades, and created a network for farmers to share resources and advice. Slowly but surely, the community started thriving again. Small farms that had been struggling found new opportunities to grow and succeed. One evening, as the three of them sat on the porch watching the sunset, John turned to Richard with a thoughtful expression. "You know, son, when you left those years ago, I worried I'd lost you forever. I thought you'd forget where you came from." Richard shook his head. "Never, Dad. Everything I've done, every success I've had, it all started here. This place shaped me in ways I didn't fully understand until now." Mary reached out and squeezed both their hands. "We're proud of you, Richard. So very proud." As the sky turned shades of pink and orange, John felt a deep sense of contentment wash over him. Life hadn't turned out exactly as he'd imagined, but in many ways it was better. He had his family, his farm, and the respect of his community. More importantly, he had hope for the future, for his son, and for the generations to come. Later that night, as John climbed into bed beside Mary, he reflected on everything that had happened. From the arrogant representatives who had tried to bully him into selling his land to the moment Richard stepped onto the porch and called him Dad again, it had been quite a journey. Through it all, one thing remained clear. No matter how much the world changed, some values never lost their worth. Hard work, integrity, and the unbreakable bond of family. And so, under the vast expanse of stars, John drifted off to sleep with a smile on his face, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them. With Mary by his side, Richard standing tall, and the soil beneath his feet reminding him of where he belonged.